Greetings. This is Davis Schofield, Continuum of Care Administrator for South Dakota Housing Development Authority. This recording is the 2021 Basic Housing Inventory Chart, or HIC chart training. First off, thank you for your assistance. HIC completion is a vitally important task that South Dakota Housing for the Homeless Consortium, or the South Dakota COC, completes each year. It is very important that all the information obtained for the HIC is complete and accurate. This activity is a requirement of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's COC funding. The HIC also helps us to determine the housing and emergency resources available across South Dakota to help people experiencing homelessness or formerly homeless folks. The HIC helps us to better understand any disparities in resource allocation geographically in order to assist in the efforts to better meet the needs evident. The HIC and the PIT, point in time survey, work together to provide important data. Now I'd like to refer you to our screen where we're looking at the 2021 HIC form. As you can see, I have entered some data, but first I want to go over some important information at the top. Please remember that for every bed you count, you must answer how many people were in those beds on the night of the PIT count, which for South Dakota is Tuesday, January 26, 2021. For emergency shelter and transitional housing projects dedicated to serving homeless, a completed homeless PIT survey must accompany and equal the housing inventory chart bed use. And we're going to talk about this a little more in a little bit. For example, if you state there were 6 people in the beds in the night of the count, there must be 1 completed housing inventory chart and 6 homeless surveys need to be completed. And this is for emergency shelter and transitional housing projects, because those folks are considered literally homeless. PIT surveys should be completed using the Counting Us app, the Counting Us link, which is probably the preferred method for projects because you can use your desktop computer to complete that. Or as a last resort, you may use a PIT survey, right? A paper survey. PIT surveys and HIC forms for domestic violence projects are all collected by South Dakota Housing Development Authority. And there is a corresponding training for domestic violence and human trafficking agencies that is also available. If using PIT count paper surveys for your projects, please return surveys to your regional or city lead coordinator by Friday, January 29th, 2021. And always remember, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact your regional or city lead, or you can contact me, Davis, at 773-3445 or at my email, which is listed on the form. Okay, so let's take a look. It's January 26th, 2021. We're a project serving homeless folks. As you can see, I've filled out some information here as if I were a project. First and foremost, everyone fills out this first page. This is where we get some basic information about your project, about your agency. First thing is agency name. Our example is ABC Agency, and then next we need to know the project name. Sometimes these are different, sometimes these are the same. In this case, the project name is ABC Homeless Shelter. Next, we need to know project housing type. For our example, this is a site-based, single-site project. You also have these other choices, though, depending on how you serve folks. So we have, for example, site-based cluster multiple sites, or you could be a tenant-based program, possibly for rapid rehousing, or, as we're seeing occurring quite a bit, voucher beds, right? We're seeing a lot of voucher beds with COVID-19. the need to decompress shelters, things like that. Next, you need to put your project site address. Here's a fictitious one that I created. So where your project is located, contact name, the person that we could speak to if we have questions. In this case, it's Jane Smith. This is her number. Her email is listed. And then we also need to know the counties that are served by this project. In our case, our example, it's in Pierre, right? So it's Hughes County. All right. It's also vitally important that we know the funding sources for our projects. The first question here is your project HUD McKinney-Vento funded, right? So, and the example is yes. But we also were wondering, is there other federal funding sources? And yes or no there. And then we asked you to list what federal funding sources you have. And in our example, this is an emergency solutions grant funded project, which as you can see, there's a variety of choices down here. All right. Next, HUD wants to know what the target population is for our project. So the folks we're serving, is there a target? There's only 3 choices in this. So either your domestic violence and human trafficking program, or you're serving folks with HIV/AIDS, or none of the above. So in our example here, it's none of the above. Next, since we're working on an emergency shelter, this is the emergency shelter form. We need to determine the type of shelter your agency is. It's an emergency shelter. We're seeing more and more, as an example, hotel and motel vouchers also being used. And we're seeing these used alone and in combination. But you can see there's other options as well. The RIDE programs, working with youth, seasonal emergency shelter, perhaps a cold weather shelter. In some parts of the state, we have those that open up from time to time. And then we have some VA-funded emergency shelter situations as well. So the next question is, after we've determined, so for our project, remember our example, this is an emergency shelter. It's facility-based, so think about that in terms of sort of the brick and mortar traditional homeless shelter. That's what our example is. Some examples will be, use voucher beds, and in that case, you would check that. You could check 1 or 2 of these in combination, depending on whom your folks are serving. So the next important thing to consider is the sort of households you're serving. How is your shelter organized in this situation? So you have households with children, or you have a situation of households without children. And so what we need to know here is how many beds are employed and how many rooms. So in this situation for households with children, this shelter has 3 units or bedrooms within the shelter with 6 beds. And this is a ESG funded program. So there are 6 total HMIS beds within this segment, right? But they also have shelter beds for folks without children. And this is also an ESG project, right? Same project. So these beds are also HMIS beds, so they're in our HMIS system. And this is sort of a situation where you have one room with many sleeping cots. Okay, it's important to realize that some folks may have dedicated spots in this situation for veterans beds. We see that from time to time. Those beds could be recorded here, and it's important to realize that those beds will also fall within the situation of either a household with children or a household without children. So these 2 numbers should equal, for this situation, your total beds. These would be beds that we would record, but they don't add to the total. So you could have, for instance, 5 of these beds without children that are actually dedicated to veterans. Then we would put that here, but the numbers wouldn't correspond that way in the end. We wouldn't add 5 more veterans beds to that. The veterans beds would also be found here. So it'd just be a way to sort of designate that some of these beds in the without children are also veterans beds. Okay, you also need to consider whether any of these are homeless youth beds. And in that situation, you would also fill this out. if they're under 18 or 18 to 24, for example. In our example, there's also overflow beds at this emergency shelter. So they have 5 beds that they've added that are overflow. In some situations, we have seasonal beds. So in that case, we identify only seasonal beds that were open on the night of the count. And then we need the dates of sort of when those seasonal beds are available. Okay, and so, right, an important part of the HIC form is that we need to know how many people were in those beds that night. And for this example, it was 61. So if we look back up here, this shelter was 100% full. There were 6 folks in these beds, there was 50 folks in those beds, and an additional 5 folks here, which adds up to 61. And then it's important that we would need a point in time survey for each of these 61 people. We would need to survey them. And then those 2 numbers need to correspond exactly in order for us to report those properly to HUD. Okay, let's look at a transitional housing program for an example. So it's the same thing. You would fill this out. The first page, we always fill out the first page. Your agency name, the project name, the address, the location of the project. We're going to need contact. We're going to need to know who the funding source is. We're going to need to know what the target population is. And in this example, for this transitional housing program, this is a Veterans Administration grants per diem intensive transitional housing. As you can see, there are far fewer options here for transitional housing. We have much less transitional housing options in South Dakota as compared to emergency shelter. And we have a lot less sort of designated types. So in our situation here, this is a veterans program. These are beds without children. There are 12 total beds. This is in 1 unit for an example, so it's basically 1 room with 12 beds in it. These beds aren't currently in our HMIS program, so there's a 0 there. These are all veterans beds, so there's 12 veterans beds in this 1 unit, right? But these aren't in HMIS. So as you can see, these numbers correspond. We only add them actually once. This just is a more description of these same beds. And in the end, there were 6 people in this program on the night of the count. We can also, of course, look at the youth portion too. These could be, if these were youth beds, right? If this was, for instance, this RI program here was checked, and then we would fill this out for youth. But on our example, there were 6 people in the beds that night, right? So that 6 of the 12 beds were full, so this had about a 50% occupancy rate for our fictitious program here. Okay. Finally, we have the rapid rehousing programs, the permanent supportive housing programs, and other permanent housing programs. And as you can see, there's quite a range of programs here. This is, again, we would fill out this form with the information we need based upon this particular project. There are agencies, for instance, that have multiple projects. So they would need to fill out this form for each type of project, right? Each individual project. And they would also need to make sure that this information here is adjusted as well, depending on the project. Different contact people, very likely. Different address, very likely, that sort of thing. Maybe a different targeted population. So all that needs to be done to ensure that we're recording that accurately. Here in this example, we're going to look at, this is an ESG funded rapid rehousing program. As you can see, there are a number of different rapid rehousing programs. There's ESG, COC, HOF, and VA. Those are all different rapid rehousing programs or projects. So we also have permanent supportive housing listed here. We also have HOPWA and HUD-VASH, and the grants per diem program, transition in place. So for example here, this is a ESG funded rapid rehousing program. It's important to remember when we're recording the bed inventory for rapid rehousing that we only record the inventory that's counted that's being used for rapid housing on the night of the count. Now that's different, right? That's different for how we record the bed and inventory for permanent supportive housing projects. It's differently recorded. For permanent supportive housing projects or the VA grants per diem, we count all the inventory that's available from their applications materials on the night. So example, if you had a 29 unit, permanent supportive housing project, you would record 29 as your units from your application, and then the amount of beds from that, which is different from how we do it for rapid rehousing, which we actually only count for rapid rehousing for inventory the folks in the beds that night. So for our example, this is the ESG funded rapid rehousing program. They have households dedicated with children, households dedicated without children. They had 20 units with children, 50 total beds. It's ESG funded rapid housing, so all 50 of these beds are in our HMI system. Without children, there was 2 units and 2 beds, right? So 2 basically 1-bedroom units. These beds are also in our program. And as you can see, these numbers correspond, 52 and 52. 50 plus 2 and 52. How many were in the beds on that night? 52 for our example. And remember, this is an ESG rapid rehousing example. So keep in mind for the HUD-VASH housing inventory charts that I will work directly with the VA staff to complete those. Those are done just a little bit different, and I found that it's just easiest for me to work with them to complete this. There's really 2 projects involved, but a substantial amount of beds, so we can get those done fairly quickly, just kind of working together and talking about it. And that goes too for the HUD HOPWA programs. I'll also do that working directly with the project itself. So that is the basic 2020 HIC training. Thank you so much for your time and for your help with this. We sure appreciate it.